A year ago, I was standing in a hotel lobby in Buenos Aires, staring at my phone like it had turned into something dangerous. Suitcases rolled past. A clerk at the front desk smiled at a guest and asked, "Todo bien?" Everything looked ordinary, the kind of place that pretends nothing bad can happen inside its glass doors. Then I read the message again. It was from my boss, Graydon. "We're cutting you loose. Your company card is canceled. Figure out how to get home yourself, loser." No call. No warning, just that blunt paragraph, and suddenly I didn't know who I was anymore. Employee, traveler, mother with a plan. My throat tightened, but the tears didn't come. Shock has its own kind of dryness. I checked my wallet. $40. My return flight wasn't for another week, booked through the company travel account. My hotel room was on the company card, too. I didn't know what had been canceled and what hadn't. I only knew I was far from home, and the ground under me had disappeared. My hands typed before my mind caught up. "Thank you for letting me know." It was a ridiculous reply to a message like that, but I'd spent years learning how to stay polite when people were unkind. Politeness had kept my job. That night, it felt like a thin coat in a storm. I sat on a bench near the wall. People walked past as if I were part of the furniture. A television over the bar played a soccer match with the volume low. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the players looked so sure of where they were running. I wanted that kind of certainty. All I could think about was my daughter, Ivy. At the time, she was 7, and she measured time the way children do, by birthdays, by whether I was there at bedtime. Her birthday had been a few days earlier. I'd missed it. I'd mailed gifts and recorded a video message in my hotel room singing, "Happy birthday," in a whisper. My sister Priya called me afterward and said, "She just wants you home, Ria." I told her, "Soon." I meant it. Now soon felt like a promise I couldn't afford to break. If you're listening to this right now, maybe in your car or sitting somewhere quiet, thank you for staying with me. Stories like this can be uncomfortable, especially if you've lived long enough to know how quickly life can tip. I'm telling mine because I wish someone had told me earlier that being treated as disposable isn't normal, even if it becomes familiar. I'm 32 years old. I'm a single mother. Ivy's father faded out of our lives in slow steps until there was nothing left to argue about. After that, every decision I made had the same question under it. How do I keep a roof over our heads, and how do I keep my child feeling safe? That's how I ended up at Belmar Goods. Belmar sold luxury, handbags and accessories, shiny things with big price tags. My title was buyer coordinator. I wasn't an executive. I was the person who worked with suppliers and kept deals moving. Calls, emails, negotiations, the careful work of trust. Graydon was my boss. Mid-40s, always polished, always impatient. When I explained that relationships take time, he'd reply, "I don't need excuses, I need outcomes." If I pushed back, he'd remind me that jobs were hard to come by. The message was clear, "You're lucky I let you stay." Then Belmar needed leather, good leather, on a tight timeline, for a spring collection. They'd been trying to secure a partnership with a workshop in Argentina called Familia Reyes Leather Works, run by Eduardo and his wife, Lucia. Their reputation was strong, and they didn't rush into contracts. They cared about respect. Belmar had money, but money alone wasn't convincing them. So Graydon sent me to Buenos Aires to fix it. For 3 weeks, I lived out of a suitcase. I took buses instead of taxis to save the company money. I ate cheap street food and drank too much strong coffee. I spent long days in Eduardo's workshop, where the air smelled like leather and dye, and the floor was dusted with tiny shavings that stuck to my shoes. I listened. I adjusted terms. I tried to make sure everyone could win without anyone feeling cheated. Slowly, it worked. By the end of the 3rd week, we had an agreement ready, a partnership worth $12 million over 2 years, enough leather to carry Belmar's spring season and beyond. Eduardo wanted the signing to be a real moment, with family present, like a promise instead of a transaction. I remember walking back to my hotel that day, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, proud, not just relieved, proud. Wednesday evening, the night before the signing, I went down to the lobby to check my folder one last time. Inside my bag was the unsigned agreement, crisp and heavy with possibility. I was thinking about calling Ivy, about hearing her voice and telling her, "I'm coming home." That's when my phone buzzed. Graydon's message appeared, and in a single breath he called me a loser and cut me loose. I checked my card. He wasn't lying. It was canceled. $40 in my wallet, an uncertain flight, and a hotel that might not be mine by morning. I sat there for a long time, watching strangers pass, thinking about the humiliation of asking Priya to wire me money, thinking about Ivy's face if I didn't come home when I said I would. And then something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something clear. I looked at my bag. I thought about the agreement inside it, the one Belmar desperately needed, the one Eduardo had insisted must go through me, and I realized that Graydon had just thrown away more than an employee. He had thrown away the person holding the entire deal together. When people hear the word luxury, they picture velvet curtains and champagne, the kind of life that looks effortless from the outside. But the truth is, luxury is built on ordinary people working very hard in very unglamorous ways. At Belmar Goods, my desk was wedged between a copy machine that jammed twice a day and a window that barely opened. My job title, buyer coordinator, sounded important enough to impress relatives at Thanksgiving, but it mostly meant I was the bridge between people who made things and people who sold them. I chased signatures. I compared fabric samples under fluorescent lights. I kept track of shipments and schedules and the kind of small details that can quietly ruin a company if you ignore them. The work itself didn't bother me. In fact, I liked parts of it. I liked learning how things were made, how a good zipper could outlast a bad one, how a dye bath could change a leather's personality, how a craftsman could spot a flaw you'd miss even if you stared for an hour. I respected the hands behind the product. What wore me down was the way I was treated. Graydon believed fear was a management style. He walked into the office like the air belonged to him, and he spoke to people the way you'd speak to a malfunctioning appliance. If a junior analyst made a mistake, Graydon didn't correct it. He performed his disappointment for the whole room. "Do you know how replaceable you are?" he once said to a coworker named Tessa, loud enough for everyone to hear. Tessa's cheeks turned red, and she stared at her keyboard like it might swallow her. Graydon enjoyed moments like that. He liked the silence afterward. I learned to keep my head down. That wasn't who I wanted to be, but it was what I did. I told myself I was doing it for Ivy. Ivy was the reason I woke up, the reason I kept my voice steady when I wanted to shout. She had my dark eyes and an expression that could melt you one second and challenge you the next. She was 7 then, all elbows and curiosity, the age when children ask questions that sound simple but land heavy. "Mom, why do you always work?" she asked one night while I was making her lunch for the next day. I paused, holding a slice of bread. "So we can have the things we need. But you're tired all the time." "I know," I said, swallowing. "I'm sorry, baby." She touched my arm gently, as if she could smooth the tiredness out of me with her small hand. "It's okay," she whispered, like she was comforting me instead of the other way around. That's the kind of thing a child shouldn't have to do. My sister Priya helped whenever she could. She picked Ivy up from school when my meetings ran late. She sat with her when Ivy had a fever and I couldn't leave the office. Priya never made me feel guilty. She just showed up, but I still carried the guilt because guilt is what mothers do when they can't be everywhere at once. When the Argentina trip came up, I didn't want to go. Not because I was afraid of travel. I wasn't. I'd traveled before, even alone. I didn't want to go because Ivy's birthday was coming and we'd been talking about it for weeks. She wanted a space party. She wanted cupcakes with silver sprinkles and balloons that looked like planets. She wanted me there. That last part mattered most. When Graydon called me into his office, he didn't ask if the timing worked for me. He said, "You're going to Buenos Aires. The Reyes workshop is dragging their feet. Get the contract done. We need that leather for spring." I tried to keep my voice calm. My daughter's birthday is next week. Could we send someone else or push the trip a few days? Graydon leaned back in his chair and smiled like I'd told a joke. You can celebrate birthdays anytime. This deal is time sensitive. She's 7, I said softly. It's important to her. It's important to Belmar, he replied, and the smile disappeared. I didn't ask about your personal life, Rhea. Don't make this difficult. That was Graydon's special talent, making you feel selfish for being human. I went home that night and tried to explain it to Ivy in a way that wouldn't break her heart too much. I have to go on a work trip, I said, brushing her hair before bed. Her eyes widened. On my birthday? I'll be gone for it, I admitted, but I'll celebrate with you when I get back. We'll do 2 birthdays. She considered that, lip trembling. But who will sing to me? The question hit me in the chest. I will, I promised. I'll call you and I'll sing. I won't forget. She nodded, brave the way children can be when they're trying to please you. Then she turned her face into her pillow so I wouldn't see the tears. I sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed, and in the dark I felt something inside me split. One part moving forward because it had to, and one part staying behind, aching. A few days later, I was on a plane, watching the United States shrink into a patchwork beneath the clouds. I told myself it was temporary. Just a trip, just work. Buenos Aires greeted me with warm air and a kind of city music, voices, engines, distant horns, the rhythm of a place that belonged to itself. I checked into a modest hotel, nothing fancy, and called Ivy every night. I told her the same things. I missed her. I loved her. I'd be home soon. On her birthday, I sat on my hotel bed and watched her blow out candles through a video call. Priya held the phone steady. Ivy smiled for me, but her eyes looked tired in a way that made my heart clench. I sang Happy Birthday quietly so the neighbors wouldn't complain. When the call ended, I stared at the screen until it went dark, and I promised myself I'd make it worth it. That's the part people don't tell you. When you sacrifice something for work, you want the sacrifice to have meaning. If it doesn't, the bitterness settles in deep. At the workshop, Eduardo Reyes was not the kind of man Graydon could intimidate. Eduardo was in his 60s, with hands that looked like they'd held 1,000 tools. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, and he watched people closely. His wife, Lucia, stood beside him often, quiet but sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who could read a room in a glance. Eduardo told me the truth on my first day. Your company is in a hurry, he said, in careful English, but hurry is not respect. I nodded. I understand. He studied my face. Do you? I did. Too well. Over the next 2 weeks, we worked through every detail: quantity, pricing, quality standards, delivery schedules, penalties for delays. I didn't push him like Graydon would have. I asked questions. I listened to the answers. When Eduardo explained why certain deadlines were impossible without harming quality, I believed him. Lucia started bringing me mate tea in the afternoons. Eduardo began calling me Señorita Rhea, with a faint smile, and little by little a deal that had been stuck for months began to move. Then, on the 3rd week, Eduardo said something that caught me off guard. When we sign, he said, tapping the draft contract with his finger, it must go through you. I blinked. Through me? Yes, he said, not through Graydon. He's the director, I reminded him carefully. He'll want to be involved. Eduardo's eyes narrowed slightly. He is not involved in trust, he said. You are. I should have heard the warning in that. I should have realized what it meant for my own position. But at the time, I only felt the relief of progress. I thought Eduardo was simply showing respect. Now I know he was doing something else too. He was making sure the deal had a human face, a specific one. Mine. And the night before we were supposed to sign, I walked down into the hotel lobby with that unsigned contract in my bag, believing I had finally done something right. Then my phone buzzed, and Graydon reminded me just how little my work mattered to him, until it didn't. Buenos Aires has a way of making you feel both welcome and alone at the same time. In the mornings, when I stepped out of my hotel, the city would already be awake. The sidewalks were busy with people carrying coffee and bread, talking fast in Spanish, laughing as if time had never hurt them. The trees along the streets cast a kind of soft shade, and sometimes, just sometimes, I could pretend I wasn't there on borrowed money and borrowed patience. But then I'd glance at my phone, see a new message from Graydon, and the illusion would break. He didn't ask how things were going. He didn't ask whether the workshop needed anything or whether the timeline made sense. He sent short commands like he was talking to a machine. Need confirmation today? Push harder. Stop playing nice. I'd read those messages and feel my jaw tighten. Then I'd take a slow breath, because I knew something Graydon refused to understand. You can't bully people into giving you their best work. You can only bully them into giving you the bare minimum, if they give you anything at all. Eduardo's workshop sat outside the tourist parts of the city, in a neighborhood where the buildings weren't polished and nobody was trying to impress anyone. The first time I arrived, a dog barked from behind a fence, and a boy on a bicycle rolled past without looking at me twice. It felt real. It felt lived in. Inside the workshop, it was like stepping into another world. There were long wooden tables with cutting marks worn into them, racks of hides hanging like heavy curtains, and shelves stacked with tools that had been cared for the way you care for something you rely on. The air always carried the same mix of smells: leather, dye, warm dust, and something faintly metallic, like old keys. Eduardo would greet me with a nod and a firm handshake, and Lucia would offer a quiet smile. She didn't waste words. She didn't need to. She could tell what kind of day it was going to be by the way I held my shoulders. At first, our meetings were formal. We sat at a table, papers spread between us, and we went line by line through the contract. Eduardo spoke in careful English, occasionally pausing to find the right word. When the language failed him, Lucia would help, or he'd switch to Spanish and gesture toward the materials, letting the work speak for him. I was careful. I asked questions instead of making demands. I told them what Belmar wanted, but I also told them what I could promise and what I couldn't. I didn't pretend I had more power than I did. That honesty changed things. After a few days, Eduardo began showing me the process, not just the paperwork. He held up 2 hides and asked me to feel the difference. One was supple and smooth, beautiful to the touch. The other looked similar, but it felt stiffer, less alive. This one, he said, pointing to the second, looks fine at first. But in a year it cracks. In 2 it breaks. People blame the maker, not the buyer. He looked me in the eye. You want to sell something that lasts, yes? Yes, I said, and I meant it. My grandmother used to say, buy once, cry once. She was the kind of woman who'd rather own 1 good coat for 10 years than 5 cheap ones that fell apart. In that moment, I understood Eduardo's pride. He wasn't just selling leather, he was selling his name. Over time, I noticed how the people in that workshop moved. They didn't rush. They didn't waste motion. They worked with the quiet concentration of people who had spent their lives getting something right. It reminded me of older folks in my family, the way they cooked, the way they fixed things, the way they took care of what they had because they knew replacement isn't always an option. There was a calmness in that place that I hadn't felt in my office back home. And still, the pressure followed me. Every evening, I called Ivy. She told me about school, about a science project, about how Priya had made spaghetti the night before and let her sprinkle extra cheese. She tried to sound cheerful, but I could hear the small ache underneath. Children are honest even when they're trying not to be. One night after I told her I missed her, she asked, "Mom, do you miss me more than your job?" The question made my eyes sting. "I miss you more than anything," I said. "This job is just how I take care of us." There was a pause. Then she said, "Okay." Like she was filing the answer away somewhere. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the blank wall. I thought about how many times I'd told myself I was enduring Belmar for Ivy's sake, and I wondered, quietly, if Ivy would ever ask me why I stayed so long in a place that made me smaller. The next day, we reached a turning point with the contract. We'd worked through the last major issue, delivery schedules that respected the workshop's pace without leaving Belmar empty-handed. Eduardo leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and said, "This can be done." Relief washed through me so quickly I almost laughed. "Thank you," I said. "I'll send the final draft to Belmar this afternoon." Eduardo didn't nod the way I expected. Instead, he looked toward Lucia, then back to me. "No," he said calmly. "You will bring it. In person. And when we sign with you." I felt a flicker of confusion. "You mean you don't want Graydon here?" Eduardo's face hardened just a little. "I want your company to honor the agreement, but I will not honor him." There was something final in his tone, not angry exactly, just settled. I chose my words carefully. "He's my supervisor. He will want to be part of the signing." Eduardo's eyes narrowed. "Your supervisor does not understand partnership," he said. "He understands taking." Lucia spoke for the first time in several minutes. Her English was softer than Eduardo's, but it was clear. "We watched how he talked to you," she said. My chest tightened. You heard him?" She nodded. "On the call. He did not know the phone was on speaker." Her gaze held mine, steady and almost maternal. "A man who speaks to his own people like that will speak to us like that later." I swallowed. That call had happened 2 days earlier when Graydon insisted on checking in. I had stepped outside the workshop to take it, but Eduardo's phone had been connected to mine for translations earlier, and I hadn't realized how easily the sound carried. Graydon's voice had cut through the air like a blade. "Are you done yet?" he had said. "Or are you still making friends?" I had tried to stay measured. "They're close. They just need time to finalize." "Time?" he snapped. "Ria, I could replace you in a day." At the time, I'd clenched my teeth and kept talking because what else could I do? But now I understood. Eduardo and Lucia had heard it and they'd decided something in that moment. They weren't just negotiating with Belmar anymore. They were choosing who they trusted. That should have made me feel proud. Instead, it made me nervous, because if Eduardo insisted on me being the point person, then the deal wasn't as secure as I'd thought. It depended on my role, and my role depended on Graydon. Still, I pushed forward. I needed this to work. I needed to go home with a victory big enough to justify the sacrifice. The day before the signing, I went over every page one more time, checking numbers, clauses, dates. The agreement sat in a folder that felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. $12 million. 2 years. A partnership that could stabilize Belmar's production. And, quietly, it could stabilize my own life, too. If I brought this home, maybe Graydon would finally have to acknowledge my value. Maybe I could ask for a raise, better hours, some respect. That night, I walked back from the workshop as the sun was lowering over the city, turning the buildings gold for a few minutes. I remember thinking, this is what progress looks like, not fireworks, just steady steps. I went down to the lobby later to confirm the next day's schedule and make sure my documents were safe. I carried my bag close to my side like it contained something fragile. It did. That was the moment, right there under the lobby lights, with strangers moving around me and the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass, when my phone buzzed. And before I even opened the message, a strange certainty passed through me, as if my body knew something my mind was still trying to deny. I've learned that bad news doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it shows up in a clean little rectangle on your screen, while the world around you keeps behaving like nothing happened. My phone buzzed. I glanced down. Graydon. For a split second, I thought maybe he was going to congratulate me. Maybe he'd finally say, "Good work," or "We're counting on you tomorrow." I know how foolish that sounds now, but hope has a way of surviving in people who've been pushed down for a long time. It keeps breathing even when it shouldn't. Then I opened the message. "We're cutting you loose. Your company card is canceled. Figure out how to get home yourself, loser." The words didn't feel real at first. I read them once, twice, 3 times. My eyes moved over the letters like they were in another language, and my brain kept refusing to translate them into meaning. Cutting you loose. Cancelled. Loser. I looked up from my phone, half expecting someone in the lobby to be watching me, to be laughing. But nobody paid attention. A couple walked by holding hands. A man in a suit checked his watch. A hotel worker wheeled a cart of towels toward the elevator, like this was just another Wednesday night. I stood there, very still, and tried to do the math in my head. My room was charged to the company card. My meals, my transportation, even the flight home, most of it ran through Belmar's accounts. If the card was canceled, my key could stop working. The front desk could tell me to leave. My return ticket could evaporate. I walked to a quiet corner of the lobby and opened the banking app on my phone. The balance on my personal account wasn't good. Rent back home, after-school care, groceries, those things eat money like a slow fire. I had $40 in cash and not much else I could reach quickly. My mouth went dry. I tried to swallow and realized my throat was tight, like someone had wrapped a string around it. I sat down on the bench along the wall. The leather of the seat was cool against the back of my legs. My hands trembled, so I tucked them under my thighs to hide it from myself. I thought about Ivy. I pictured her in her pajamas, curled on the couch with Priya, hair still damp from a bath, the little crease between her eyebrows when she was worried but trying not to show it. She trusted me. She believed my promises. She believed I was coming home, and here I was, in Buenos Aires, suddenly unemployed, with a boss who had decided my life was something he could discard with a single insult. I should tell you something about that kind of moment. When you're younger, you think humiliation will feel like a loud slap, but when you're grown, when you've lived through bills and responsibility and the steady weight of caring for other people, humiliation feels like being made invisible. Like you don't even deserve a proper ending. A part of me wanted to curl up right there on the bench, put my head in my hands and cry until someone asked if I was okay. But another part of me, older, calmer, maybe the part that came from the women who raised me, stayed upright. I took a slow breath. Then I did the first practical thing I could think of. I checked whether the company card was truly canceled. I walked to the front desk with my heart thudding in my ears and asked in careful Spanish if I could charge a bottle of water to my room. The clerk typed on her keyboard, polite and bored. Then her eyes flicked up. "Lo siento," she said gently. It was declined. Declined. A clean word, like the lid snapping shut. I nodded as if this was nothing. "Gracias," I whispered, and stepped back before my face could betray me. Back on the bench, I opened my bag. Inside was the contract folder, thick paper, clean signatures waiting to happen. The agreement Belmar had been chasing for months, $12 million on the line, and sitting right there in black and white was the clause Eduardo had insisted on, key communication and relationship management through me. At the time, I had thought Eduardo was simply making a point about trust. Now, with Graydon's message still burning on my screen, that clause looked different. It looked like leverage. I don't say that proudly. I wasn't trained to see the world that way. I was trained to be grateful, to keep my head down, to do my job and hope kindness would be rewarded. But kindness isn't a plan. And in that lobby, with my future hanging by a thread, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. Belmar didn't value me as a person. They valued me only as long as I was useful. Well, I was useful. I stared at the folder for a long time. My mind ran through options like a metronome. Call Priya, beg for money, beg for help, go to the embassy, try to find a cheap flight, try to argue with Graydon, try to make him reverse it. And then I pictured him reading my plea and smirking. No, I thought. Not this time. I stood up and the movement made me dizzy. I grabbed my bag and walked outside into the night air. Buenos Aires after dark can be beautiful. Streetlights glowing, people gathered at cafes, music drifting from somewhere you can't quite find. But that night, I didn't feel the romance of it. I felt the distance. I felt the risk. I found a bus stop. The schedule was confusing, but I asked a woman in line and she pointed me in the right direction. I paid with a few of my precious dollars and stepped onto the bus. The seats smelled faintly of old fabric and rain. The bus rocked as it pulled away, and I pressed my forehead against the window, watching the city slide past. My reflection stared back at me. Tired eyes, tight mouth, a woman trying to look composed while her life was quietly unraveling. Somewhere between one stop and the next, something inside me settled. Not peace, exactly, more like acceptance. I couldn't change what Graydon had done, but I could decide what I would do next. When I arrived near the workshop, the streets were quieter. The air smelled like damp pavement. The neighborhood dogs barked in the distance. I walked the last block with my bag heavy on my shoulder, heart pounding again. Because now the stakes weren't just my pride, they were my daughter's stability. A light was on inside the workshop office. I hesitated at the gate, then knocked. A moment later, Lucia opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Ria," she said softly, "is everything okay?" I should have lied. I should have said I forgot something, or I needed to confirm a detail. That's what I would have done at Belmar, wrap pain in polite paper so no one else had to look at it. But something about Lucia's face, steady, unafraid, made me tell the truth. I was fired, I said. The words felt heavy as they left my mouth. Tonight. By text. Lucia's expression didn't change into pity. It changed into something sharper, understanding and anger on my behalf. Eduardo appeared behind her, pulling on a sweater. "Fired?" he repeated like he couldn't believe the audacity. I nodded and held up my phone. The message glowed there, ugly and plain. Eduardo read it once, then he looked at me for a long moment as if weighing something. Finally he said, "Come in." They brought me into their small sitting room, a simple space with family photos, a worn couch, a kettle on the stove. Lucia poured me tea with hands that didn't shake. Eduardo sat across from me, elbows on his knees. "Your boss," Eduardo said carefully, "he does not respect anyone." I stared into the cup. I thought if I delivered this contract, he'd have to respect me, I admitted. I thought maybe I could make things better. For my daughter. Lucia's voice softened. "You have a daughter." "Yes," I said, and my throat tightened again. "She's waiting for me to come home." Eduardo nodded slowly. "Then you must do what is right for you." I looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Eduardo leaned forward and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Tomorrow, we sign, but we do not sign with Belmar if you are not there, and Belmar has chosen to throw you away." He paused. "So now, the question is not what Graydon wants." My pulse picked up. "What is the question, then?" Eduardo's eyes held mine. "The question is what you want." For a moment, the room felt very quiet. I could hear the kettle ticking as it cooled. I could hear my own breath. I thought about Ivy. I thought about years of swallowing insults. I thought about a boss calling me a loser, like I was something he could scrape off his shoe. I thought about all the times I had been loyal to people who would never be loyal back, and I realized I was standing at the edge of a decision that could change everything. I didn't have a plan yet, not a perfect one. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something else rising underneath the fear. A sense of dignity. That night at Eduardo and Lucia's home, I didn't sleep the way people sleep when they're safe. I slept the way you do when you're holding your breath, even in dreams. Lucia offered me their guest room. The sheets smelled like laundry soap and sunlight, clean and ordinary in a way that almost made me cry. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. Quiet creaks, a distant dog barking, a small hum of life continuing. My phone was face down on the bedside table. I didn't want to see it light up again. I didn't want another message from Graydon. I didn't want to be reminded of how quickly a person can be reduced to nothing in someone else's eyes. Instead, I replayed Eduardo's words. "What do you want?" It's a simple question, but when you've spent years doing what you're told, it can feel like a foreign language. Want, not need, not must, want. I wanted to go home to my daughter. I wanted to keep a steady paycheck. I wanted to be treated like a human being. I wanted to stop feeling like my life depended on staying small. Somewhere in the early hours, I finally drifted off. When I woke, the sky outside the window was pale and the house smelled like coffee. Lucia was already up, moving quietly in the kitchen. She handed me a mug without asking, as if she knew I needed something warm in my hands. Eduardo sat at the small table with the contract folder in front of him, not touching it yet, like a man waiting for the right moment. He looked up when I entered. "Good morning, Ria." My voice came out soft. "Good morning." Lucia set a plate of bread and fruit on the table. "Eat," she said gently. It wasn't a suggestion, it was care. I took a bite, even though my stomach was knotted. I forced myself to swallow. There are times when your body wants to shut down, but you can't let it. Not when people are counting on you. Not when your child's life is tied to the choices you make. Eduardo folded his hands. "Today is the signing day," he said. I nodded. "Yes. And Belmar expects it," he continued, watching me carefully. "But Belmar has fired you." "Yes," I said again, feeling the shame try to rise. I pushed it down. Shame was not my problem today. It was theirs. Eduardo tapped the folder lightly. "This agreement," he said, "was built by you, not by Graydon. He did not sit with us. He did not listen. He did not understand our work." Eduardo's voice hardened slightly. "He thinks money is enough." Lucia's eyes were steady on mine. "We will not reward that." I took a slow breath. "Then what happens?" Eduardo leaned back and looked toward the window for a moment, as if gathering patience. Then he said, "There is another company." I already knew what he meant. Aurora Luxe. Belmar's biggest rival, another luxury brand, newer, with a reputation for treating suppliers better. We'd heard their name in the office the way you hear a storm approaching, as a threat. Eduardo continued, "They have been trying to work with us. We said no, because we did not yet trust them. But we have watched you, Ria. We have seen how you work." He paused. "If we sign with someone, we want the relationship to be managed by you." The words sent a pulse of panic through me. "But I don't work for Belmar anymore," I whispered. Lucia's voice was calm, almost practical. "That is why you must work somewhere else." The room felt too small for my thoughts. The idea of changing my whole life in a single day sounded impossible. I wasn't a bold person. I wasn't the kind of woman who made dramatic moves. I was the kind of woman who packed lunches and paid bills and kept going. But there I was, in a kitchen in Argentina, with two people looking at me like I mattered. Eduardo reached for his phone. "If you agree," he said, "I will call Aurora Luxe today. I will tell them that the partnership is available, but only if they respect the terms we have already built, and only if they respect you." My mouth went dry. "What if they say no?" Eduardo shrugged. "Then we do not sign with anyone. We wait. We are not desperate." That sentence hit me with the force of a lesson. We are not desperate. I realized how often Belmar had acted desperate without admitting it. Desperate for margins, desperate for control, desperate to win at any cost. Eduardo and Lucia weren't desperate. They were patient. They were willing to lose money rather than lose dignity. I wanted to be more like that. Still, my mind ran through practical fears. "I have to get home," I said quickly. "My daughter, my sister. I can't be stranded here. I don't have money for a flight. I don't even know if I have a hotel room tonight." Lucia set her hand lightly on the table. "One thing at a time," she said. "First, we handle the truth." Eduardo nodded. "We will handle today." He made the call in front of me, on speaker. He didn't hide anything. He didn't soften his words the way I always had. The phone rang. Once, twice, a woman answered. Her voice was clear and professional. "Aurora Luxe Procurement." This is Isa speaking. Eduardo spoke in Spanish at first, then switched to English. Isa, my name is Eduardo Reyes, Familia Reyes Leatherworks. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her posture change. Mr. Reyes, she said, surprised but composed. Yes. We've spoken before. Yes, Eduardo said. Today I call with a different offer. We have an agreement drafted. It is ready, but we will not sign it with Belmar Goods. Another pause, sharper this time. May I ask why? Eduardo's voice stayed steady. Because Belmar does not respect partnership, and because the person who built this agreement, Ria, was fired by Belmar last night. I flinched hearing it said so plainly, but Isa didn't sound startled. She sounded interested. Ria, Isa repeated as if tasting the name. Ria who? Eduardo looked at me. Ria Patel, he said into the phone. Buyer coordinator. She has been with us for 3 weeks. She understands our standards, our timeline, our needs. We trust her. The agreement must be managed by her. Isa didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quieter. Is she with you now? I swallowed. Eduardo looked at me again. I nodded. He held the phone toward me. My hand shook slightly as I took it. Hello, I said, trying to keep my voice from cracking. This is Ria. Ria, Isa said gently, I'm sorry to hear what happened. Then, very simply, are you safe? No one at Belmar had ever asked me that question, not once. The kindness of it nearly broke me. Yes, I managed. I'm safe. Good, she said. Listen carefully. I'm going to ask you some questions, not to interrogate you, just to understand where things stand. She spoke like someone who'd done this before, calm, direct, respectful. She asked about the draft contract, the production capacity, the delivery schedule, the quality standards. I answered as clearly as I could. I found myself speaking not like a frightened employee, but like a professional, because that's what I was, even if Belmar had tried to make me forget. When we finished, Isa said, I need to bring this to our executive team. Can you meet today? Eduardo answered before I could. Yes, Isa continued. Then here is what we're going to do. We will send a car to pick you up. We will sit down, face to face, and we will talk about bringing this partnership to Aurora Lux. She paused. And Ria, if we do this, we do it with you, not around you. My eyes stung again. I blinked hard. Thank you, I whispered. After we hung up, Eduardo looked at me with the faintest smile. Now, he said, we tell Graydon the truth. My stomach flipped. Do we have to? Eduardo's expression was firm. Yes, he said. Because he must learn that people are not trash. He dialed Graydon's number and put the call on speaker. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. Graydon answered on the second ring, irritated. What? Eduardo spoke calmly. Graydon, this is Eduardo Reyes. We were scheduled to sign today. There was a pause. Yes, Graydon said sharply. Is Ria with you? Eduardo looked at me, then back at the phone. Ria is here, he said. But she does not work for you anymore, correct? Graydon didn't bother pretending. She doesn't, he said. So talk to me. I'm the director. Eduardo's voice remained even. No, we will not sign with Belmar. What? Graydon snapped, and I could hear his breath change, the way it does when someone loses control. That's not negotiable. Eduardo's reply was calm enough to be chilling. It is always negotiable. We are not signing because your company has shown disrespect, especially to Ria. You fired her by message, insulted her, and canceled her card while she is in my country. Graydon laughed once, sharp and ugly. She's not your problem. Eduardo's eyes hardened. That is where you are wrong, he said. She is a person, and she is the reason we would have signed. Now we will not. Graydon's voice rose. Eduardo, listen, this is business. Don't get emotional. We have a deal. Eduardo leaned forward slightly, voice still controlled. No, he said. You have paper. A deal requires honor. Then he said the line that I will never forget because it was the sound of someone closing a door forever. Belmar has no more options. There was a moment of stunned silence on the speaker. Then Graydon snapped, "Who do you think you are?" Eduardo didn't hesitate. "Someone who chooses respect," he said. "Goodbye." He ended the call. I sat there, breathless, like I'd just watched a wall fall. A car arrived an hour later, black, clean, with a driver who opened the door for me as if I were someone important. I wasn't used to that. I almost apologized, out of habit. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you," and got in. As the city passed by outside the window, my thoughts raced. I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. I was still frightened. I didn't know what Aurora Lux would offer. I didn't know how I would get home to Ivy. I didn't know whether I was stepping into a miracle or another trap. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of a crisis. I felt seen. The Aurora Lux office in Buenos Aires didn't look like a place where people got yelled at for doing their jobs. That was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't flashy. It was calm. Clean lines, warm lighting, quiet voices. A receptionist greeted me by name like I belonged there. The driver carried my bag as if it weighed nothing. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, because when you've spent years bracing for impact, peace can feel suspicious. Isa met me in a conference room with a wall of windows. She was around my mother's age, maybe mid-40s, and she carried herself like someone who didn't have to prove anything. No sharp edges, no performance. She wore simple jewelry, nothing loud, and her eyes didn't dart around looking for weakness. "Ria," she said, standing to shake my hand. Her grip was firm and warm. "I'm glad you're here." I sat down carefully, the way you do when you're trying not to take up too much space. I set the contract folder on the table like it might explode. Isa glanced at it, then looked right at me. "Before we talk business," she said, "tell me what you need right now." The question landed in my chest. I had learned to answer questions like that with the safest response. "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I was tired in my bones. I was worried about my daughter. I didn't even know where I was sleeping that night, so I told the truth, quietly, plainly. "I need to get home to my daughter," I said, "and I need to not be stranded here." Isa nodded once, as if that was the most reasonable thing in the world. "We can handle that," she said. "Now let's talk about the deal you built." She didn't say it like a compliment. She said it like a fact. That alone felt like a kind of healing. We went through the agreement line by line. Isa asked smart questions, questions that showed she'd actually read the draft, not just the headline numbers. She asked about production realities, shipping risks, quality checks. When I explained why certain timeframes were possible and others weren't, she didn't argue. She listened, then adjusted. Halfway through, she leaned back and said something that made my throat tighten. "You did good work," she said. "Not good for your position. Not good enough. Just good." I looked down at my hands so she wouldn't see my eyes shine. I was 32 years old, and I felt like a child who had finally been spoken to kindly by an adult. Isa brought in 2 other leaders on video, one from New York, one from Milan. I expected skepticism, suspicion, maybe even a lecture about corporate procedure. Instead, they spoke to me as if I were the subject matter expert, because in that moment, I was. When the call ended, Isa folded her hands. "Here's what I propose," she said. "Aurora Lux will take this partnership. We'll honor the terms you negotiated with minor adjustments for our internal timelines. And we want you to manage the relationship because Eduardo has made it clear the trust sits with you." My heart beat so loudly I thought she might hear it. "And what does that mean?" I asked. "For me?" Isa didn't hesitate. "It means we offer you a position," she said. "Supplier relations lead for this account, with the option to expand your portfolio over time." I stared at her. "I'm not—" I began, then stopped. Old habits, old doubts, the instinct to say I didn't deserve it. Isa's expression softened. "Ria," she said, "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a job because you already did the work." I swallowed. I have a daughter, I said, almost apologetically. I can't be gone all the time. Issa nodded again. I have 2 sons, she said. I know what travel does to a family. We'll build the schedule around your life, not the other way around. That doesn't mean no travel, but it means we plan it with respect. Respect. That word kept showing up like a light in a dark hallway. What about today? I asked, voice smaller than I meant it to be. My hotel, my flight. Belmar canceled everything. Issa picked up her phone and made 2 short calls. She didn't sigh. She didn't treat it like an inconvenience. She spoke as if solving problems was simply part of the job. When she finished, she looked at me. You'll have a hotel tonight under Aurora Lux, she said, and we'll book your flight home as soon as we confirm the earliest reasonable option. Not the cheapest, the safest. I felt my breath catch. Thank you, I whispered. Issa held my gaze. Don't thank me for basic decency, she said gently. Just remember it exists. Later that afternoon, I went back to Eduardo and Lucia with Issa and her legal advisor. The signing wasn't theatrical. It wasn't a victory dance. It was a calm, deliberate choice. Eduardo wore a clean button-down shirt. Lucia stood beside him with her hands folded, eyes steady. Issa greeted them in Spanish, respectful and careful, and Eduardo's posture relaxed a fraction. They talked about craftsmanship, about long-term planning, about what partnership should mean. It felt like adults building something, not predators taking bites. When the papers were signed, Eduardo looked at me across the table. You see, he said quietly, respect brings work. Work brings stability. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My throat was full. That evening, in the hotel Aurora Lux arranged, I called Ivy. Priya held the phone, and Ivy's face filled the screen. She looked older than she had a few weeks earlier, like my absence had stretched her. When she saw me, her eyes brightened, and I felt something inside me unclench. "Mom!" she squealed. "When are you coming home?" "Soon," I said, and this time I meant it with something solid behind it. "I'm coming home very soon." "Did you fix your work?" she asked, serious. I took a breath. "I changed my work," I said softly, "because I needed a place that treats people better." She frowned, trying to understand. "Were they mean to you?" Priya's eyes flicked to mine, sister to sister, one look filled with all the things we don't say in front of children. "Yes," I admitted, "they were mean, but it's okay now." Ivy studied my face like she could read the truth under my words. Then she nodded, solemn. "Good," she said. "I don't like mean people." After the call, I sat by the window and watched the city lights blink. I thought about how close I had been to begging Graydon for my job back. How close I had been to accepting humiliation as the price of survival, and I thought with a kind of quiet awe, how quickly the world can change when someone decides to stop accepting the wrong treatment. The next morning, Issa forwarded me an email thread that made my stomach tighten. Belmar's legal team trying to reach Eduardo, trying to reach Aurora Lux, trying to reach me. The messages were sharp at first, then they became frantic. Accusations, threats. Finally, a different tone. "Let's discuss resolution." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The contract wasn't theirs. The relationship wasn't theirs. They had burned the bridge while I was still standing on it. A day later, Issa told me Belmar had called Aurora Lux directly, demanding negotiations. Issa's reply was calm and simple. "You do not negotiate from disrespect." That phrase felt like a door locking behind me. When I finally boarded my flight home, my hand still trembled a little as I held the boarding pass. Not from fear this time, from the weight of what had happened, from the shock of surviving it. I landed, took a taxi straight to Priya's place, and when Ivy opened the door, she threw her arms around my waist like she was trying to glue me back into her world. I held her so tight I felt her small ribs rise and fall with each breath. "I missed you," she mumbled into my sweater. "I missed you more," I said, kissing the top of her head. "I'm here." I didn't tell her everything. Children don't need the whole story. but I promised her one thing quietly, with my cheek against her hair. "I'm not going to let people treat me like that anymore," I said, "because when they do, they're also treating you like you don't matter. And you do." Weeks later, word drifted back like gossip always does. Belmar's spring production stumbled, deadlines slipped, quality complaints rose. Suppliers who had tolerated Graydon's bullying began to step away. When your business is built on people's hands, and you don't respect those hands, eventually the work stops coming. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumph the way movies show it, with champagne and laughter. What I felt was quieter. I felt free. A year can change a person in ways that are hard to explain unless you've lived through the kind of fear that forces you to grow. When I look back now, I don't think of that hotel lobby in Buenos Aires as the place where I was fired. I think of it as the place where I finally stopped begging to be treated decently. Life didn't become perfect after that. I want to be honest about that, especially for anyone listening who has lived long enough to know that happy endings are usually made of ordinary days, not fireworks. But life did become steadier. And steadier is a kind of joy. Aurora Lux kept its word. They didn't turn me into a traveling machine. They didn't dangle family-friendly language and then punish me for needing a life outside the office. Issa built my schedule with care. When travel was necessary, it was planned. When I needed to be home, I was home. We signed the initial partnership with Familia Reyes Leatherworks, and then we expanded carefully, one supplier at a time, with respect as the first rule. I learned things I hadn't been allowed to learn at Belmar because Belmar didn't invest in people, they consumed them. At Aurora Lux, I was expected to think, to contribute, to build. It was frightening at first, like being handed the steering wheel after years in the passenger seat. But once I adjusted, I realized something. I wasn't lucky to have the job. I was qualified. I had always been qualified. The difference was that I was finally in a place that could see it. Belmar, on the other hand, began to unravel the way a poorly stitched seam unravels, slowly at first, then all at once. It didn't happen because of magic or karma falling from the sky. It happened because their foundation was rotten. Suppliers talk. They talk quietly, person to person, across time zones and languages. They remember who respects them and who doesn't. Belmar had been skating by on reputation and aggressive deals, but once the Reyes partnership fell through, other cracks started showing. The spring collection was delayed, then the next one. Customers who paid high prices began to complain about quality, stitching uneven, leather stiff, hardware tarnishing too quickly. Those details matter in luxury. If you charge someone a premium, they expect something that lasts. When it doesn't, people don't just return a bag, they lose trust. I heard, through industry contacts, that internal meetings at Belmar turned into blame games. Graydon didn't suddenly become humble. He became louder. He demanded people work harder. He demanded faster timelines from suppliers who were already fed up. He squeezed, and all he did was prove Eduardo right. A man who doesn't understand partnership only knows taking. Eventually, Belmar's leadership did what companies like that always do. They looked around for someone to sacrifice. And Graydon, for all his swagger, wasn't untouchable. Not when numbers are down. One day, Issa forwarded me a short industry note. Belmar Goods announced a leadership restructuring. Graydon's name wasn't listed anymore. I stared at that message for a while. I expected to feel something sharp. Victory, satisfaction, even revenge. Instead, what I felt was a strange emptiness, like watching a storm finally move on after it has already done the damage. His downfall didn't repair what he'd taken from people. It didn't give Tessa back her confidence, or give me back the birthdays I'd missed, or give back the quiet dignity so many employees had been forced to swallow. But it did confirm something I needed to know. People like that don't win forever. Not because the world is always fair, but because you can't build anything strong by treating human beings like disposable parts. About a year after Buenos Aires, Aurora Lux opened a new flagship store in New York. Issa invited me to the opening. "Bring Ivy," she said. "If your work supports your family should be allowed to see it." I took Ivy on a weekend trip. It was her first time in New York City, and she pressed her face to the taxi window like she was watching a movie. "Mom," she kept saying, look at that." Buildings like cliffs, lights like stars, people moving fast like they had someplace important to be. The store opening was elegant without being cold. The staff greeted people warmly. There were pieces on display that I recognized, not just as products, but as stories. A handbag made with leather from Eduardo's workshop, a belt with hardware sourced through a supplier I'd vetted carefully. A small accessory line that used materials from makers who had never been treated like vendors, only like partners. Ivy held my hand as we walked through the store. She was small in that world of polished floors and designer labels, but she didn't look intimidated. She looked curious. She stopped at one display and pointed. "That one," she said. "It's pretty." It was a handbag in a warm, rich color, the kind of leather that feels alive. A sign beside it described craftsmanship and heritage. The words were marketing, yes, but underneath them I could see the truth. The hands that made it, the years behind those hands, the respect that allowed those hands to keep working. Ivy looked up at me. "Did you make this, Mom?" I smiled softly. "I didn't make it with my hands," I said, "but I helped the people who make it do their work the right way." She frowned. "How?" I knelt beside her so we were eye level. "By listening," I said, "by making sure they were treated fairly. By making sure we didn't ask them to rush or cheat their craft. Good things last when people take care." She thought about that, then nodded, like it made sense in a way children understand better than adults. You don't get something good by being mean. Issa came over and greeted Ivy. "So this is the famous Ivy," she said with a smile. Ivy held her chin up, proud. "I'm Ivy," she announced, as if Issa might not know. Issa laughed softly, then looked at me. "You did this," she said, not in a grand way, but with quiet certainty. "And you're just getting started." I felt my throat tighten again, because I remembered the hotel lobby. I remembered $40 and a canceled card and a text message that called me a loser. I remembered how small I'd felt, and there I was, a year later, standing in a place where my work mattered, with my daughter holding my hand, seeing me not as a tired woman always leaving, but as someone building something solid. That's the part I want to leave you with, if you're still listening. Sometimes the cruelest people in our lives aren't powerful because they're strong. They're powerful because we're exhausted, because we're scared, because we have responsibilities and bills and people who depend on us, and we convince ourselves we have no choice but to take what we're given. But here's what I learned, the hard way. When someone shows you they don't respect you, believe them the first time. And when someone throws you away, don't crawl back to the place they tossed you from. Don't beg for a seat at a table where you're only welcome as long as you stay quiet. There is a difference between being loyal and being trapped. Loyalty is earned. Traps are designed. Graydon didn't ruin Belmar all by himself. A company becomes like that when a lot of people allow a Graydon to act that way. But he did reveal something true. Disrespect is expensive. It costs relationships. It costs quality. It costs trust. And eventually it costs the people who practice it too. As for me, I'm still a mother first. I still pack lunches. I still worry. I still have nights where Ivy wakes up from a bad dream and I sit by her bed until she falls back asleep. But I do those things now without the constant weight of being treated like I don't matter. And that has changed the way I carry myself in the world. Thank you for spending this time with me and for listening to my story. I truly wish you good health, peace of mind, and happiness with your family. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own worth, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.